The Battle of Isstvan III marked the official beginning of the Horus Heresy. Here, the traitors tore off their masks for the first time and bared their blades against their brothers. In this battle, a small number of warriors stood against an enemy force far superior to their own. It was a war song of sacrifice and glory, and a clash between loyalty and betrayal. Today, let's take a closer look at the opening battle of this rebellion on Isstvan III. The Isstvan system is located in the Ultima Segmentum, far from Terra. During the Great Crusade, it was reconquered by the Astartes of the 19th Legion, the Raven Guard. Afterward, personnel from the Expeditionary Fleet established an imperial government on Isstvan III and began rebuilding the planet. Now, however, an urgent report came from Isstvan III. The planetary governor, Vardis Praal, had betrayed his mission for unknown reasons. Like the traitor Temba on Davin, he had embraced the local barbaric religion and renounced the imperial truth. Terra issued instructions for Warmaster Horus to lead forces to suppress the rebellion. Thus, in the 5th year of the 31st millennium, under the Warmaster's leadership, 4 legions, the Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Death Guard, and Emperor's Children, gathered in orbit above Isstvan III. People did not yet know that the great Horus had been corrupted by chaos, and that the other 3 legions and their primarchs had also joined the Warmaster's camp. Under the manipulation of the dark gods, warp storms began to spread again, hindering astropathic communication and the efficiency of long-distance travel. Horus intended to eliminate all loyalists remaining in his forces on this planet far from Terra, purging any unstable elements. These traitor legions were rife with small brotherhoods known as warrior lodges. This was a culture promoted by the first traitor Primarch, Lorgar, and his Wordbearers Legion. This culture encouraged Astartes within the Legion to form small groups of 3 or 5, setting aside rank and duty to deepen the bonds between comrades, thereby improving combat efficiency on the battlefield. However, this culture also made the spread of chaos ideology much easier. Brothers in the warrior lodges trusted each other and often spoke freely during their gatherings. In such small groups, if just one person had been seduced by chaos, they could use the tone of a brother to subtly spread propaganda to other members.
These members would then contact other comrades, and the overlapping roles allowed corruption to pass through various small circles. It started with small complaints about the endless Great Crusade, then perhaps distaste for the Council of Terra and contempt for mortals. Finally, when the Warmaster was ready to launch his rebellion, ostensibly to bring a brighter future to the Astartes and humanity, everything fell into place naturally. Distortion and corruption, fueled by the passion for chaos, spread silently through the traitor legions in this way. Outside of these whispering small groups, there remained staunch supporters of the imperial truth. Many of these men were veterans from 200 years ago, Terran-born Astartes. Long before their primarchs were reunited with their legions, they had dedicated their lives to carrying out the master of mankind's will. These elites, with centuries of combat experience, represented the original loyalty and glory of their respective legions. Therefore, when vicious words of rebellion spread through the warrior lodges, these men were naturally isolated and excluded from the circles. They lamented the growing rift between Astartes' brothers, never imagining that behind the cold brotherhood lay true betrayal, and that they themselves had become enemies of their primarchs and their entire legions. Before carrying out the so-called pacification of Isstvan III, Horus secretly ordered the primarchs of these legions to select these isolated or untrustworthy individuals and place them all into the vanguard. This force consisted of over 100 companies of Space Marines alone, numbering nearly 100,000 men. Horus ordered the vanguard to board drop pods capable of only a one-way trip and launch a light assault on the rebels of Isstvan III. Facing such a massive Astartes force, the mortal rebel army of only a few million on the ground was crushed within hours. In the eyes of the victorious loyalist warriors, they had once again defended the integrity of the Imperium and fulfilled their glorious duty. However, when these ground forces on Isstvan III attempted to hail the Warmaster in orbit, they received no reply. Furthermore, all communication channels were suddenly cut. Then, massive quantities of virus bombs were dropped from orbit. This was Horus's true purpose for coming to Isstvan III. He had sent all the untrustworthy elements under his command to the surface as an assault force, making it easy to wipe them out in one stroke.
The virus bomb is a terrifying weapon of mass destruction, carrying the Life-Eater virus. It can spread across an entire planet's surface within minutes. Even Astartes' power armor cannot provide adequate protection against such a weapon. Biological matter exposed to the virus is broken down at the cellular level, dissolving into a puddle of sludge. Even forests degrade into rotting swamplands. Simultaneously, the biological matter decomposing under the virus releases vast amounts of flammable gas into the air. When this gas is ignited, intentionally or unintentionally, the entire planet's atmosphere catches fire, rapidly forming a doomsday firestorm that ravages the surface, burning all combustible material to ash and leaving only bare rock. When Horus dropped the virus bombs on Isstvan III, the planet's 8 billion civilians were instantly killed. Of course, the lives of these mortals no longer mattered to the Warmaster. However, the Loyalists on the ground were not defeated. In fact, the virus bombs only wiped out about 1/3 of the Loyalist Astartes. This was because, within the fleet in orbit, there were still Loyalists who, for various reasons, had not been sent to the ground. Among them were Captain Nathaniel Garro of the Death Guard's 7th Company and Saul Tarvitz, a captain of the Emperor's Children. Upon realizing the Warmaster's betrayal, both men made correct and difficult choices. Captain Garro seized the frigate Eisenstein. He helped Captain Tarvitz, who flew a Thunderhawk gunship through the blockade to the surface of Isstvan III, successfully warning the Loyalists that the virus bombs were coming. Subsequently, Captain Garro began a difficult breakout toward Terra to report the treason occurring here. Thanks to Captain Tarvitz's warning, everyone scrambled to find any sealed bunkers, tunnels, or similar facilities nearby to escape the bombardment. After the virus dissipated and the fires died down, the Loyalists emerged from their shelters. The environment had been completely altered by the virus bombs. Crimson dust and grit were everywhere. Looking at the scene before them, the hearts of the Astartes changed drastically. Anger filled their chests. Their brothers and fathers had betrayed them. The Loyalists lost nearly 40,000 men in this bombardment, but the real battle was just beginning.
Although they had no means to leave the planet, the Loyalists wanted to make these despicable traitors bleed and pay the price, even if there was only a sliver of a chance. And indeed, the fleet in orbit did not launch another bombardment. Instead, inexplicably, they began deploying ground forces to attack. These infantrymen, lacking heavy equipment, Loyalist Death Guard, World Eaters, Emperor's Children, and the last of the Luna Wolves, began constructing defensive fortifications, preparing to fight the enemies from the traitorous Brotherhood. In reality, when the firestorm ravaging the planet had just extinguished, the Warmaster in orbit had detected that at least 60,000 Loyalists were still alive. But this should have been futile. With only light equipment, they had no ability to counter orbital attacks. Just as the Warmaster was preparing to order another bombardment, he discovered that his brother, Angron, Primarch of the World Eaters, had disobeyed his orders. Angron had led 50 companies of Space Marines in a drop-pod assault, personally going down to attack the Loyalists on the ground.
Angron was once a gladiator slave. In his youth, he was implanted with the butcher's nails. This device penetrated the skull and pierced directly into the cerebral cortex, constantly stimulating Angron's mind, making him perpetually angry, brutal, and bloodthirsty. After Angron was found, this device was even introduced into his 12th Legion, making the World Eaters incredibly frenzied in combat. The World Eaters often turned standard military operations into bloody, indiscriminate massacres. When Angron learned that the Loyalists on the ground were still alive, the butcher's nails in his head began to buzz. Already consumed by rage, he could no longer hold back his fury. He rushed toward the Loyalists with 2 chain axes in hand. Angron's actions disrupted the Warmaster's plan. What was supposed to be a quick, decisive, and clean operation had now turned into a ground war. Although Horus was furious, he could not abandon the World Eaters yet. The Warmaster needed the strength of every ally to prepare for the upcoming total war with the Imperium. Therefore, he had no choice but to order the other legions to drop as well, and launch a ground war alongside Angron. The Warmaster decided to use overwhelming military force to crush the Loyalists on the planet, thereby declaring his absolute authority, for Horus would not lose any war he was involved in. Thus, the ground war on Isstvan III officially began. The earlier orbital bombardment had thoroughly changed the ecology of Isstvan III. Thick clouds piled up in the sky, blocking out the sun forever. Continuous dust accompanied by heavy rain and gale-force winds fell from the sky. These conditions became natural cover for the Loyalists. Under the command of Luna Wolves captains Garviel Loken and Tarik Torgadon, the Loyalists infiltrated the ruins of Isstvan III. Using the shattered capital city, the Coral City, as their main battlefield, they began a guerrilla war against the attacking traitors. Although the Warmaster's forces had various air support and armoured vehicles, they could not effectively utilise their advantages in such harsh and complex ground conditions. Moreover, the Loyalists were filled with rage. They believed that although they had no way out, every moment they delayed Horus on this planet, and every traitor soldier they eliminated, was a victory.
At the same time, they were providing cover for Captain Garro, who was breaking out in the Eisenstein, forcing the traitors to focus more on Isstvan III and ignore other pressing issues. The first battle of Isstvan III erupted within the World Eaters Legion. 2,000 loyalist World Eaters, led by Captain Erlen, charged toward Primarch Angron, who had just stepped out of his transport, and his force of about 5,000 traitors. The battle between warhounds was bloody. Soon, the two waves of World Eaters were locked in a brutal melee of chain axes against chain axes. The loyalist World Eaters were heroic. Burning with anger at the betrayal, they launched frenzied attacks on the traitors. But they were too few in number, and the enemy had a Primarch. Angron slaughtered his sons like a mad beast, leaving a trail of dismembered corpses wherever he went. Captain Erlen, who led the charge, eventually died in this battle, pulled down by several traitors and torn limb from limb. After dealing with this small wave of loyalist sons, Angron dispersed his troops into the ruins of the city's north to slaughter any remaining living creatures. No tactics, no objectives. The mad Primarch wanted only more killing. The traitors' air power swept through the city ruins, searching for survivors, but the heavy rain and strong winds interfered with their vision. The Loyalists were putting up determined resistance in the mud pits of the Coral City. They used the city's sewers and other facilities to conduct flexible guerrilla warfare, consuming as much of the traitors' effective strength as possible. In the northwest of the city, the Loyalist Death Guard, experts in siege warfare and defense, held the line. They occupied the bunkers and fortifications left by the local rebels, standing like an unbreakable sword between the enemy forces. However, the Death Guard also faced immense pressure. Traitors were attacking them from two sides, and Primarch Mortarion was constantly testing the limits of his loyal sons. Mortarion was not as impatient as Angron. He knew how difficult it was to attack his sons when they were entrenched in solid cover. So Mortarion brought up powerful heavy artillery to bombard the Loyalists, slowly crushing their defensive lines like an indestructible iron wall. On Isstvan III, every day, the Loyalists wore down Horus's strength. The war of attrition between traitors and Loyalists in the ruins of the Coral City lasted for 3 Terran months.
However, Horus had far more troops in support than the Loyalists. He could constantly replenish personnel and supplies for his ground forces, while the Loyalists had only glory and rage. Their ammunition gradually ran out, and their armor became increasingly shattered. By this time, 3 months later on Isstvan III, the violent hurricanes and rainstorms began to dissipate. The Loyalist situation was becoming increasingly dire. Their time was running out. With the change in weather, Horus's troops began to slowly clear the ruins under the cover of heavy armor, clearing more and more guerrilla zones. Casualties continued to mount. Finally, when the last surviving 100 or so Loyalist Space Marines retreated into the city's precentor's palace to make their last stand, the Warmaster halted his attack once again. He recalled all ground forces. After a brief silence, the warships began orbital bombardment again. No precise targeting was needed. Horus's fleet simply had to cover the entire planet with round after round of artillery fire. The Loyalists did not run this time. They knew Horus would not stop the bombardment again, and they were too tired. In the end, except for the miraculously surviving Luna Wolf's Captain Loken, almost all Loyalists on Isstvan III vanished in this belated second orbital bombardment. This was a war whose outcome was predetermined. However, the loyal Astartes used their wisdom and courage to delay Horus's plan. In those brutal 3 months, they severely damaged the traitors' effective strength. Most importantly, Captain Garro, who broke out in the Eisenstein, successfully escaped the system and headed for Terra. The reason the Warmaster stopped the final ground attack was precisely this. His brother, Fulgrim, brought him bad news. Fulgrim had originally intended to persuade his old friend, Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, to join the rebellion. But the loyal 10th Legion Primarch angrily rejected Fulgrim and attacked him. Now Terra likely knew of their betrayal. Horus could no longer waste time on Isstvan III. Fortunately, the chaos powers of the warp had become his allies. Under the influence of warp storms, the Imperium's information transmission and fleet mobility were greatly diminished, while his troops could move unimpeded. The Warmaster intended to use these advantages to gain the upper hand in the imminent next confrontation. This campaign would determine the future course of action for the traitor legions.
As long as they won this battle, they could march toward Terra in great strides. The battlefield for this campaign had already been chosen by the Warmaster, the nearby Isstvan V system. Another tragic battle was about to begin.